All right. So good to be with you all again. It's the middle of Thanksgiving break. It's Wednesday morning. Wanted to knock out a lot of this stuff over the break so that when we start again, we can just hit the ground running, so to speak. So hopefully you guys are all having a great Thanksgiving right now, thinking about you. Be safe, of course. And we're now getting into a huge pivotal moment in American history. We did the revolution, which was a hugely impactful event, part of our whole national character, identity, the revolution. But now we are going to talk about the Civil War, our greatest crisis that we ever faced. Some would say that it was tantamount to a second American Revolution, and I'm one to pretty much agree with that. If we were any other country, like France, for instance, they sort of delineate, because their history is so much longer than ours. They have these huge blocks or periods where, they name it as, the monarchy period or the empire of Charlemagne or whatever, Holy Roman Empire for parts of France. And they have these long periods, the First Republic, the Second Republic, et cetera, et cetera. They are now on their fifth republic, their fifth constitution. Technically, we're on our second. Remember, our first was the Articles of Confederation. That didn't work, but we didn't have a violent revolution. It was sort of a sit down, work the problems out, and let's overthrow this government peacefully, but without like a military solution. Just sort of gentlemen lawyers got together, and they had so much clout because it was Washington and Franklin and Madison, all these people that took part in the revolution, and they wrote us a second constitution. Problems were solved for a while. The revolution the Civil War, in numerous ways represents just a total break with that period. Number one, secession. The 11 states in gray here voted through state conventions to withdraw themselves from the Union. That's effectively a revolution. It's a breaking up of the republic that we had created in 1789 and a forming of a new one working essentially in tandem with the first. It was a revolution because slavery was obliterated. Nobody anticipated in 1860 that slavery would be totally wiped out within 5 years. Most people, even in the North, the most radical abolitionists, believed that probably it would take another 20 years or so. Which brings up another point, which is that no other country in the modern era, when slavery means African slavery, had to fight a civil war to do away with it. Britain just voted in Parliament in 1834 and just got rid of it. Now, remember, Britain didn't have slavery itself, but in Barbados and in Jamaica and all of their Caribbean possessions, they did have slavery. They had slavery in the United States when we were still British North America. They planted it here. In a weird way, politically speaking, because we were so free, slavery lasted for so long. Here's what I mean by that, is that in Britain, all power rested in the central government, so people far away from slavery living in London voted to wipe it out in Kingston, Jamaica. Didn't work that way in the US. It wasn't, men living in DC and in New York who voted to obliterate slavery. It was a state issue. People in the North really had nothing to say about slavery other than in the territories, which is relatively minor. And so because of that, the South held on to it for quite some time. Now, this, you get irony upon irony here. One thing that I will say as a proud American, when, often Europeans, other countries, people in Mexico will say, well, we abolished slavery before you guys did. Mexico in 1824 in their constitution, Britain in the 1830s, France in the 1790s. To which I will reply, well, we are a federal system. That was not an issue that the national government had any control over. It was the states. And in some of the states at the time of the Revolution, slavery was abolished. Remember that Vermont is the first. 1777, Vermont wrote into their constitution that slavery is abolished because of the revolution, because all men are created equal. We're now a free republic. And this is an institution, slavery, that is really relegated to the past, and it should be, only used when you're sort of a colonial subject. inappropriate now. All of the New England states followed suit there. Massachusetts in 1780, et cetera, et cetera. All of New England abolished slavery right at the time of the Revolution. The middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, they all phased in emancipation over about 25 years. So basically by 1800, there's no slaves left there. But the South held on to it. And this is going to plant the seed for eventual civil war. Now, in 1776, the societies between North and South were so similar. Everybody practically was a self-sufficient farmer, 95%. So to the average yeoman farmer in Tennessee or the average yeoman farmer in Massachusetts, which was the vast majority of citizens at that time, slavery was an abstraction to them. What do I think about slavery? Well, I don't own any slaves. What do I care? And they sort of had this practical attitude of, well, we already do have slavery. We have some 2 million slaves living in this country. Just because we end slavery doesn't mean that those people, once freed, will be peaceful, will, not seek vengeance. What is going to happen? And so attitudes between North and South were very similar at the time of the Revolution. By 1860, they were unbelievably far apart. Now, our Civil War, a lot of people mistakenly just simplify and say it was about slavery. Yes, it was, but you got to be a little more specific. The ones who are really deluding themselves are a lot of Southerners, white Southerners today, who would say slavery had nothing to do with it, which is nonsense. It had everything to do with it. But it's not slavery or its abolition. Northerners didn't say, get rid of slavery now. What they were saying is, we want to stop the spread of slavery into the territories, into this green region that everybody knew would become states at some point. So let's abolish it there. We can do it on a national level, and that will plant the seed that will eventually allow some, 10 to 15 states to come into the Union free. Northerners will dominate the Senate and the House, and probably, in 1880, 1890, we will vote by constitutional amendment to outdo slavery. There'll be so many free states. So South, don't worry about it. Now, in 1820, in the Missouri Compromise, Southerners were willing to have that point of view. In the Louisiana Territory here, slavery was abolished north of 3630, the southern border of Missouri, and it was only allowed in what would be Arkansas and Oklahoma. And that was it. Southerners said, yeah, 1820, Missouri Compromise. By 1860, slavery will be done with and we'll be prepared for it. Well, by 1860, they weren't. They were even more radicalized. The 1830s had happened. They had slave revolts like Nat Turner's revolt in 1831. Abolitionism comes out and gets louder and louder and louder every year. So Southerners feel defensive. The British voted, and the Dutch did too, to abolish slavery in the 1830s. So now we were sort of the pariah state, right? A lot of people don't know this. Slavery had been sort of incidental in America. It had certainly flourished in the South, but not in the North. And even in places like Virginia, it was, essential to the tobacco economy, but it wasn't what it would become for the cotton economy, the very foundation of the South and the South's economy. And so this had changed quite a bit by 1860. Slavery was more integral to the South. It was more antithetical to the North, and it was this dividing wedge between the two sections. So let's look at slide number 1, sectional politics. After the Mexican War, and this is a wonderful line by Ralph Waldo Emerson, he coined the phrase that when the Mexican War started in 1846, he, from Connecticut, he was a preacher and then retired and then became a transcendentalist writer. He said, "We will surely conquer Mexico." This is right after Congress voted. He said, drinking with his friends, "We will surely conquer Mexico, but it will be as the man who swallows poison and in turn is taken down later. Mexico will poison us." Which, when I first read that line, I said, what does that mean? It's like, when you go to Mexico, you can't drink the water because you're going to get poisoned, so you got to bring bottled water. What are they talking about? No, that's not what he meant. What he means is this awful issue of slavery in the territories that is so explosive is now going to be right on the table for everyone to deal with, and we can't deal with it. And he was right. He saw far ahead of everybody else. Most people were rather excited when we went to war with Mexico, at least most Southerners anyway, and the Democratic Party was, and James K. Polk was. We gained a vast region. We gained Texas, California, Utah Territory, New Mexico Territory. Remember that just before the war began, we negotiated with the British for Washington and Oregon to have this border at 49 degrees latitude. So we had this vast new region, but now we had to basically decide what to do with it. Now, Washington and Oregon are so far north, they're not very warm, cotton doesn't grow there. Slavery was abolished here. We know that these are going to become free states. The purple region from 1820, this is the 3630 line in the Missouri Compromise. Nebraska and Kansas we knew would be free. Washington and Oregon would be free. Texas came in as slave, but then California came in just 4 years later to balance that out. This was always a tricky notion because the House is based on population, which meant the North dominated because they had a higher birth rate, they had a higher immigration rate, and they just had all the cities. That's where industrialization was happening. The South was only about a third of the country, population-wise, and kind of stagnant in terms of population. So this became an issue that was incredibly, incredibly divisive. Again, in 1820, it was very divisive, but we could actually solve the issue. In 1850, where we ended last time, it almost was unsolvable. Remember that part of this compromise was California would enter the Union as a free state, give it free states 2 more senators. That would balance out Texas. Southerners, especially those in South Carolina, like John Calhoun, were going to secede just over that. Well, in return, they got a very strong, vigorous Fugitive Slave Act, which Northerners didn't like, but at the time they just thought, well, that is the law. And if we are a union, we have to give slave owners the right to catch their quote unquote property back. So they swallowed hard and agreed with that in the North. Some people were so enraged. There was a wonderful short story written called The Devil and Daniel Webster. And it's about how Daniel Webster literally sells his soul to Satan. And the real life allegory of that is that Daniel Webster could have stood up and said, no, we don't agree to this compromise because it gives too much to slave owners. And he didn't do that. He voted yes for the Compromise of 1850. He voted yes for the Fugitive Slave Act. And many people in Massachusetts just said Daniel Webster could never be forgiven for this. Next, we get the DC trade ban. Remember that in the District of Columbia, it's federal territory. Slavery itself would exist, but no more buying or selling of slaves. What was the most divisive issue at the time, but actually going forward, it didn't create too many problems in the immediate term, was what to do with the rest of this territory, right? Texas was a republic. It would come in immediately as a slave state. California, just a couple of years later, would come in as a free state to balance that out. We've already got 3630 from the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So this purple area is decided. We decided in 1848 with the British that this would be free territory. So the pink territory is all that we have to decide. Back in the 1830s, there was something known as the Gag Rule, which you could not even say the word slavery for 10 years, from 1834 to 1844. You couldn't even say the word slavery in the House of Representatives because the idea was you can't fight about something if you can't talk about it. And why should we talk about it? We can't decide about it. That basically after abolitionism debuts in 1831, many people, including Northerners, just felt, why do we need to talk about this slavery issue? By that time, we did not have the territories out west from the Mexican War. We only had this purple region. Slavery, in terms of the national government, can only be decided in the territories, right? Like states decided otherwise. We had decided it in the territories and in DC, so what's the point? Let's not even speak of this. Since it's Thanksgiving, I'll tell you, my family has the Gag Rule. We've had it ever since 2008 when Obama won. My uncle, who lives in Missouri, didn't like the former president too much and was ranting and raving that Thanksgiving of 2008. And so we just decided we won't speak of politics at Thanksgiving dinner. You know, Grandma is not going to be too happy about that. We want her to live a long and happy life. And if everybody's yelling and shouting at each other, you won't have a good Thanksgiving. And that's, you know, politically, we've gotten more divided the last 12 years. And so the Gag Rule is still in effect at our Thanksgiving dinner. I don't know how it is for you guys, but if you have one of these, you know, mixed political families from multiple backgrounds, it keeps the peace. It certainly does. You can't talk about something, or you can't fight about something if you can't talk about it. It worked. Now, the Gag Rule was eventually overturned. It had to be, Because we conquered half of Mexico and we had to say, oh, now we do have to talk about it and decide about it. And we almost couldn't talk about it at that point. However, we did manage to come to an agreement. Now, they could have said, all right, slavery will be totally allowed in this territory. Northerners would not have that at all. Southerners, Northerners wanted the Wilmot Proviso. Let's ban slavery completely in the Pink Territories. Well, Southerners would say that would give too much to the North. We could have just taken this 3630 line and extended it all the way west and just cut, Utah from New Mexico and said, freedom here, slavery here. We were so divided at that time that they couldn't agree on that either. And so it seemed that the only solution that you could really have at that point is to have popular sovereignty. It was a creative decision, but basically heavily flawed nonetheless. You just say, well, Congress can't decide this issue. It's too explosive. We'll hand this over to the residents of those territories. Just let them decide it, right? Local control, popular sovereignty. A couple of problems with that. Number one, I think I mentioned this last time, it shows a failure of leadership more than anything. Number two, it's going to attract the most violent radical people to live side by side there, and they're going to kill each other, not in Utah or New Mexico, but in Kansas. And Abraham Lincoln, I think, said this best, that what happens in the territories affects us all, and therefore we should all decide on it. The future of Massachusetts is wrapped up in what happens in New Mexico. Do we become this free capitalistic country that phases out slavery actively and aggressively in the next couple decades? Or do we just deal with this problem indefinitely and it just, is passed on to future generations, and we're always this heavily flawed republic that has slaves? Okay, again, when we were founded, slavery was incidental. It existed, but there were many areas it didn't exist. By the time slavery was abolished in 1865, we were the biggest slave state in the world, meaning not like state of the United States, but country. We had 4 million slaves, more than Brazil, more than the Spanish Empire at that time. And by the way, those are the only two countries that still had slavery as late as the 1850s. That's not good company to be in, right? Is that often these stats are used that the US is one of the very few countries to, in the advanced world, to have the death penalty. And we're only one of two countries that has the death penalty for minors. The only other country, Somalia. So whenever that stat is used, you use that to basically say, well, that's not good company to be in, right? When you organize the countries and say, who's on this side, who's on that side, the US wants to be with Canada, Japan, France, Britain. No offense to Somalia, but it's a very poor, very lawless country. And, if they're the only country that's executing minors, you probably don't want to be with them. In any case, we were the same in the 1850s. We were like, oh, the US still has slavery, even though it's this free republic, but every other country has gotten rid of it. Just the Spanish Empire and the Empire of Brazil, that was it. So what actually becomes the most divisive issue in the Compromise of 1850? This one was the hardest to decide at the time. That's the one that almost broke up the Union, is the status of slavery out here in the territories. Once it was solved with popular sovereignty, it was, temporarily solved for a couple of years. That actually doesn't become the most divisive issue. We enter an era right after the Compromise of 1850, where I call it the calm before the storm. It's very much like 1770 to 1773, when the British, right after the Boston Massacre, repealed all taxes. Everything calmed down for 3 years, and then they very foolishly passed the Tea Act in 1773. Likewise here, had the South really not taken any more aggressive steps, probably we don't have a civil war after 1850. Things were relatively calm. Now, the big issue in that 4-year period, 1850 to 54, was the Fugitive Slave Act. Almost every month, there was some horrible case of a slave that had escaped, run away, got caught in some very brutal, awful way, and got dragged back to slavery in the South. One of the most infamous cases was Mr. Anthony Burns here. Burns was a runaway slave from the South. I forget which state, doesn't really matter, but he finds his way up to Boston. Abolitionist churches would buy these coffee houses and run them as sort of businesses associated with the church. And what they would do is offer jobs to slaves who had escaped. And Anthony Burns was working in one of these coffee shops. One of the slave traders from the South, I believe from South Carolina, tracked him down, um, essentially accosted him, kidnapped him in the middle of this public coffee house. Anthony Burns, as he was trained, started screaming out that he was being kidnapped by one of these slave catchers. And the slave catcher tries to take him to the jail, and there's a huge fight in the streets of Boston to try to capture him. These abolitionist militias just came out with their guns and started shooting it out with the marshals. And they're even able to get Anthony Burns away from him for a couple of hours, hide him in a church, and there's a huge gun battle in the church to apprehend him. He's finally taken back to the jail. And then the next day, reinforcements arrive from all the states. And so all these soldiers from every state in the Union grab Anthony Burns, march him down the streets of Boston, put him on a steamship, and send him back to his plantation in South Carolina. Now, in Boston, people came out to their balconies. They unfurled American flags upside down, which is a protest against the government. That's a signal when you're on the high seas that you're in immense distress, that you're like, your ship's about to sink when you have the flag upside down. And it's done as a form of political protest when you say we've so lost our way and we've made so many awful choices as a country that we're in distress, and people would hang their flags upside down to protest that. People took their rotten trash and rotten food and they pelted thousands of soldiers that were doing this. And this action probably created more abolitionists than any piece of literature ever did. Because there's an interesting phenomenon. Even when you agree with what the federal government's doing, typically people don't like that happening in their own state, right? Like, even let's say that you're, very conservative on immigration. If you saw a bunch of ICE raids all around your house in your neighborhood where people literally were like snatching kids out of the arms of their family members, arresting them, people basically, even if it agrees with their politics, they tend to say, I don't like the federal government coming in and doing this. People who don't even live in this community are coming in and exercising force with impunity, and I don't like that. And people didn't like that in the North, even if they agreed with slavery and probably agreed that Anthony Burns didn't deserve to escape, to quote unquote steal himself as a thief. They didn't like the federal government doing this. So case after case after case came up like this. There were many other cases. And like I said last time, thousands of free blacks who had lived in the North a long time immigrated to Canada at this time because they were afraid, even though I was born in freedom, I don't have the right to testify in federal court. I'm presumed to be guilty. I would have to get a white person to testify in federal court. In state court, you may be a citizen, but in federal court, you were not. And so this was an incredibly divisive issue, yet the Union held together. Most people in the North basically felt, look, I don't like this compromise either, but it's the price of peace. Just suck it up and deal with it, and we can get through this horrible crisis. Well, after 1854, that just didn't seem possible anymore. Having dragged their feet for 34 years, finally, the South was ready to say, all right, Kansas and Nebraska can start being organized for settlement. And what happens there just sends us on a long road towards conflict afterwards. So here's what happened, basically. Stephen Douglas, senator from Illinois, saw that there was a great opportunity to finish the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay, there was a web of railroads connecting the Northeast with the Northwest. Cincinnati and Cleveland would be connected with Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and New York and Boston. Chicago was as well. St. Louis was as well. And so Stephen Douglas had this idea that the railroad would go from Chicago and connect to San Francisco. If that happened, that railroad would go right through Kansas and Nebraska territory and Utah territory. So the status of slavery is very important there, because wherever you build a major traffic highway, population explodes. It happened along the Erie Canal in the 1820s. You guys have all seen the Pixar movie Cars, I'm sure. What's wrong with Radiator Springs? Why does nobody stop there anymore? Because they built the highway, and the superhighway, the 10, doesn't pass by Radiator Springs. Route 66 did, but nobody takes it anymore. No traffic, no people stopping, no money spent, and it becomes a ghost town. I hate to break it to you, but they should probably just move out of Radiator Springs. It wasn't meant to be. Likewise here, everybody knew that wherever the railroad went through, that's where the population centers would go. Southerners wanted the railroad to go from New Orleans, their biggest city, due west through Houston and then through Southern territory so that slavery might extend there, or at least slavery, or at least population wouldn't blow up in northern territories where those areas would come in as free states, right? So population grows like California, then it enters the Union as a free state. We know it'll be a free state because we banned slavery here in 1820. So Southerners, particularly Andrew Butler on the Transportation Committee from South Carolina, said, okay, we will agree to this railroad going through Chicago and free territory if we overturn the Missouri Compromise and allow slavery to spread there. Now, Douglas was one of these Northern Democrats who was derisively called a doughface. A doughface is a Northerner who's pro-slavery. Douglas wasn't so much pro-slavery, he just honestly did not care. He just wanted this railroad built because it would make his home state and his hometown of Chicago blow up in size, become a huge economic powerhouse in the Midwest. And he was willing to allow slavery in the Western territories because he just honestly did not care. And so Douglas convinced enough Northern Democrats to support this. The Missouri Compromise line is overturned, and slavery is allowed to be spread to Kansas and Nebraska. It's up to the residents there. Basically what it did is it said, hey, popular sovereignty works so well here in the pink areas. Why don't we allow popular sovereignty here? And so most Northerners felt, well, we've been stabbed in the back. We solved that issue, right? This is like a married couple who has solved a very divisive issue. And then 34 years later, they say, no, let's pick up that issue that's irrelevant now and we've already solved and everybody agreed to it. Let's pick that scab open and start, injuring ourselves again. That's basically what was done. Most Northerners called the Missouri Compromise the sacred pledge that slavery would never extend to these Western territories. At the time, that was all that was left of America. The Mexican War opened up more issues. The Northerners had to further toe the line to ban slavery. But Northerners could not believe that Southerners did this. Now, you might say, well, how on earth did it pass if Northerners were against it? Well, here's how. If you actually break it down and look at this chart, this is the vote in the House of Representatives. If you notice, here's the Whig Party, here's the Democratic Party. Here's Northerners, here's Southerners. And this is everybody over here. Now, if you notice, Kansas, Nebraska is a pro-slavery vote. It would take an area where slavery was banned and it would allow the possibility that slavery might extend there. So it's a great index. It's a great litmus test for how you feel about slavery. Look at Northern Whigs. Northern Whigs, 0 to 45. Not a single Northern Whig voted for Kansas, Nebraska. All 45 voted against it. So they're the most anti-slavery group. They were free soilers. They basically said, look, I'm not an abolitionist. I don't think slavery should be ended in Mississippi today or tomorrow. I think they should decide those issues. But it shouldn't spread to Western territories. We should abolish it there. Southern Whigs were split, about 2/3 in favor, about 1/3 against, right? There were only 19 of them in the House of Representatives. 12 said, sure, let slavery spread there. 7 said no. That made the vote 12 in favor, 52 against. So the Whig Party is mostly anti-slavery because it's mostly a Northern party. Look at this, 45 Northern Whigs, only 19 Southern Whigs. So it's, skewed. The Democratic Party. Northern Democrats about evenly split, 44 to 42. Just barely over 50% of Northern Democrats said, okay, slavery should be able to extend there. Just under 50% said, no, it should not spread there. Look at this, though. Southern Democrats are the most pro-slavery people in the whole House of Representatives. 59 of them, 57 said, yes, let slavery extend there. Only 2 said no, which meant Democrats about 2/3 or 3/4 in favor and only about 1/4 against, or 1/3. I can't really do my math there. Hopefully you get the point, though. You see that the ratios are split. Now, the reason why this passed is that the Whigs are just such a smaller party. Only 64 Whigs in the House of Representatives, 145 Democrats. Now, Northerners were more against it than in favor of it, but a lot of them were bullied. A lot of Northern Democrats were told, you won't be elected dog catcher in this town anymore if the party rules against you. And the Democratic Party was more and more being viewed as a pro-slavery party. Most of the committee chairmen were all Southerners and slave owners at that time. Most of the presidents had been. And a lot of Northern Democrats felt that they were outsiders in a party that they'd never been respected in. How many Northern Democrats had been president at this point? Really only two. Martin Van Buren and Millard Fillmore. Geez, what great rock stars. Who were the Southern Democratic slave owners? Well, you got Washington's not really a partisan person, but after him, you get Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, and on and on and on, right? The same prototype, Tyler, Polk, they were all slave owners, most of them from Virginia, in fact. And so this vote, once it was done, and in the Senate, it just barely passed, it really, really angered Northerners, particularly Northern Whigs. Okay, don't worry about analyzing all this vote. This is what I often do when we're in person. I'll have like a question about it. But you don't have to worry about, the directions on the slide. I just wanted to show it to you because this policy, this law, Kansas, Nebraska, is going to be terrible for the impact. It's the turning point where after that, there's no turning back. It's just one long march until Civil War. After the Compromise of 1850, one could look at it and see how we might have avoided Civil War, but it's all over after Kansas, Nebraska, basically. So, first, the most important impact to Kansas, Nebraska is that it absolutely killed and destroyed the Whig Party. You kind of have to feel for the Whigs. They were the Federalists, and they imploded after the War of 1812. Jackson so angered and divided half the country that you get a new party, the Whig Party, in the 1830s. It lasted about 20 years, and then it died and completely imploded in 1854. Northern Whigs were so angry at Kansas, Nebraska, they just said, "You have betrayed us. You are dead to us." This is to the people in their own party, Southern Whigs. "You voted for this. We can never trust you ever again." Notice how if we don't talk about slavery, if we talk about the tariff or whatever, people can sit down and agree to stuff. Slavery was so divisive and so integral to Southern society and so antithetical to Northern society. We couldn't talk about it as at the federal level, not keeping our national party system anyway. And so the other problem from this is that people all over the country now hear, oh, it's up to the residents of the territories, whoever gets there first decides slavery. And so what basically happens is abolitionist churches, they start passing around the collection plate and saying, donate money. If any of you would like to leave Connecticut and move 2,000 miles west to Kansas, here you go. We've raised money for you. You can go buy land, but it's important that you vote no on slavery when you get there. And so these incredibly radical, and we view them with open hearts today. We love the abolitionists, but at the time they were considered the craziest of the crazy. It would be, analogous to people that are so against abortion, they're in favor of, firebombing abortion clinics or murdering abortion doctors. And I know that's an inflammatory statement, but that's what the abolitionists did when they got to Kansas. Is they would just indiscriminately go into towns and say, this is a pro-slavery town, we're just going to murder a bunch of people, sometimes in retaliation, sometimes not. Similarly, there were pro-slavery people that moved in too, most of them from Missouri. Missouri was the neighboring closed state. It was a slave state, and they wanted to make sure Kansas would be slavery. And so a lot of poor whites called border ruffians would cross the border and take settlement there and try to vote for a pro-slavery constitution. So now you have these two elements, radical Yankees from Connecticut and, rather rough pro-slavery men from Missouri. They're all living side by side. This is a recipe for success, right? No, not really. This is going to illustrate the absolute insanity of this. This is like two parents with fighting children saying, just work it out, right? And they're rolling around on the floor, punching each other. And you just say, well, they've got to work out these issues. Well, who's the adult here? Who's the authority here? Who's the leader here? And there was none. Nobody wanted to touch this issue. And so murder starts breaking out in Kansas almost immediately. And a new party is formed in the North called the Republican Party. And it is the Republican Party of today. It was formed in 1854, right after Kansas, Nebraska. So what happens is what had been a party that had no opinion on slavery now is saying we are the anti-slavery party. And so the core of the Republican Party would be Northern Whigs. Northern Whigs so angry at Kansas, Nebraska, they said we are now a free soil party that's voting to stop slavery in the territories. A lot of Northern Democrats joined them. People like James Talmadge in 1820 who said, I don't agree with abolitionists, but slavery shouldn't spread into the territories. David Wilmot, also of Pennsylvania, Northern Democrat, but just felt my party's been taken over by radicals, so I'm actually going to vote with these Yankees. Abolitionists and free soilers, the people that were really passionate about slavery, kind of made a moral compromise, meaning I'm an abolitionist, but they don't have any chance of winning, so I'm going to vote for the Republican Party, because they'll basically do as much as one could do at the federal level, right? This is often how people vote, right? If you're a Green Party or a socialist in America, you often would say, you know, I'm just going to vote Democrat because my party's not going to win regardless, right? Same thing with the Republican Party. You have some people that are not really Republican, but they vote for it just because they dislike the Democrats so much. Same thing here. So that's the effects of Kansas, Nebraska. It divides the country. We now have a party that's anti-slavery, and the Democrats kind of reform themselves as a pro-slavery party, and that's all we talk about for the next 6 or 7 years, with each argument getting worse and worse and worse. There's this incredible moment in 1856 in May when Preston Brooks here savagely beat and almost murdered Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate, which was symbolic and very troubling. So here's the backstory. After violence started breaking out in Kansas, and it got really bad, John Brown, who they've just made a movie about him, Ethan Hawke plays him in the movie, he was one of these people like Harriet Tubman, who was the real deal. He had run these escape missions from Kentucky and Missouri up into Wisconsin and Canada. He had personally saved dozens of slaves from slavery. He was from Connecticut. He moved to Kansas with several of his sons, and he became this sort of anti-slavery militia or posse that went around killing people. He had personally killed 5 pro-slavery men in cold blood. In Lawrence, Kansas, this is the, you know, if you guys have ever been to Kansas, it's a very red state, it's very conservative, but pretty much every red state has a couple of blue pockets. It's the big cities, it's the universities. There's not too many big cities in Kansas, but Topeka, pretty conservative one, is the capital today. Lawrence was sort of the makeshift capital at the time for the abolitionists. Lawrence is where KU is, Kansas University. And so it's a pretty liberal enclave in a very conservative state. Back then, it was very, very liberal. And it was where all the abolitionists lived. And their town was attacked by pro-slavery people. Lots of buildings burned. So the next night, a lot of these anti-slavery posses went into towns like Osawatomie and Pottawatomie, right on those rivers, and launched these raids. John Brown broke into some random person's home. He and his sons just dragged them out of bed, brought them to the front porch, and proceeded to hack them to death with broadswords, sort of Old Testament style. So I don't want you to give you the impression that the abolitionists are the ones that are perfectly wonderful. I agree with their sentiment, but some of their methods were appalling. And so Sumner, who was the senator from Massachusetts, he replaced Daniel Webster. So we go from one of these people who didn't like slavery but was willing to compromise on it to Sumner, who was an ardent abolitionist, gave a speech called The Crime Against Kansas, where he basically said slavery has been abolished in the Kansas territories for 34 years. The ban on slavery was overturned there, and now it's incredibly violent. Innocent women and children are being murdered there and butchered there in cold blood. And then he pointed out Andrew Butler, who had authored this bill essentially, and said, you, sir, have blood on your hands. You have reached into Kansas and brought slavery, and how does it feel? And he just went on and on. Like, it was a 3-day speech where he just went on and on and on, attacking the South, blaming them for all the troubles in Kansas. The Crime Against Kansas was the name of the speech. And then finally, the peroration, the end, the climax of the speech is that you, sir, Andrew Butler, do not love your lady liberty. You instead love your harlot, slavery. Everybody gasped and said, oh, my word, and fainted. It was a pretty big insult. Now, if you don't understand what that means, there have always been terms for women who are not virtuous and perhaps are ladies of the town or ladies of pleasure. That's about all I'll say here about that. I'm sure you guys have your own words for this today. In the 19th century, they had various terms for this, but one of them was a harlot, which nobody uses that term anymore, but that's basically what it means. It's a pretty big insult, right? Basically saying, notice how we use female metaphors a lot. This is rather bizarre. Most ships are given ladies' names. Liberty is a woman, and so is justice. Have you guys ever noticed that? That if you go to Washington, D.C., no statue of a human being is taller than justice, and liberty itself. Lady Liberty stands atop the Capitol dome. I forget exactly how tall she is, but she's a half a foot taller than the next tallest statue, which would be, I believe, Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial. Even sitting down, he's like 19 feet tall, and Liberty is taller than him. Lady Justice at the Supreme Court, remember, she's blindfolded, she's got the scales, she's taller too. Notice that this is a weird thing that men used to do, and I guess still do, is that America is often referred to as a her. Your state often, is considered to be a woman. Your ship is a woman, and justice, liberty itself are women. And they're these beautiful women, these, wonderful, virtuous women. Well, slavery was a nasty woman, right? She was a lady who had been around the block a few times, not virtuous. And this is a big insult, saying you don't love your country as much as you love slavery, and to call it a harlot that way. Now, Andrew Butler himself just sort of shrugged this off. It was his cousin, Preston Brooks here, his face obscured in the picture, also from South Carolina, was so angry at this. Now, there was a weird custom at the time of dueling. Now, dueling, as you guys probably know from Hamilton, had been around a long time. Even Northerners did it for a while. It had basically died out by the time of the Revolution. Most men of property in the North said, if you have a problem with someone, you sue them in court or you try to work it out on your own, but you don't just kill them over it in this weird ritual. Southerners were still doing this as late as the Civil War, that if someone offended you, you took your gloves off, you whacked them in the face, you say, I demand satisfaction, and you go out and you duel them. Now, why didn't Brooks challenge Sumner to a duel? He wanted to, but you only duel among equals in the South, among social equals. Southerners felt that Yankees in the North had no honor, and what you do when someone's offended your honor and they're not your equal. If your child mouths off to you, if your wife mouths off to you, if a Northern Yankee mouths off to you, you would beat them with a cane, basically, if a slave ever disobeyed. And so this was a huge insult to Northerners, that they don't even deserve the offer of a duel. And that's what Brooks did. He snuck into the Senate. He was not a member of that chamber. He was a representative in the House. And he asked the Sergeant at Arms, where is Senator Sumner? And they pointed him out. Sumner was signing speeches at his desk, sending him to people back home. And Preston Brooks went up and blindsided him, hit him on the back of the head with his cane, knocked him unconscious, and then proceeded to beat him for about a minute. Nearly killed him. It took a while for, senators who were kind of holding back other ones to get through and rescue Sumner. And this was bad both symbolically and in a real sense. And so let me explain. Symbolically, democracy, its basic goodness, its basic strength is that it takes a chaotic universe where people use violence to attain political power through revolutions and civil wars and violent methods, and instead you go into a voting booth and you vote peacefully and everyone accepts the results. And those groups then argue it out and you accept the results of elections and votes on those issues. The Senate is the most hallowed chamber in the world in terms of democracy. And in the 1850s, this was about the only one ever. It was this highly esteemed body, and this divisive issue of slavery had penetrated into this chamber and brought violence. Very symbolically, it was the prototypical abolitionist Yankee state, Massachusetts, represented by Sumner, getting beaten very brutally by the prototypical Southern state, by South Carolina. Even worse than the beating itself was how each side received this, meaning that Sumner is nearly killed. He has to go to England to convalesce for several years. He falls into a coma for a brief period. And people left his seat empty in Massachusetts and said, I know the vote's very important, but until he heals, we're going to leave it empty so that it's a memory, a constant reminder of how violent the slavery system is. And Southerners just said, what Brooks did is terrible. We don't agree with that. And you shouldn't take that tack with us. Well, Southerners largely did agree with this because Brooks is never really punished for this. He lost his seat in the House of Representatives for a brief period. And he goes home. He's never punished for this. There's no, trial or anything like that. And he's mailed over 100 canes because his broke over the skull of Sumner. And so people mail him these canes with little messages like, hit him again, hit him harder next time. And so both sides start to say, this is just terrible, and we don't see a future together with each other. The next major issue that would further divide the country was this awful, horrible, infamous Dred Scott decision, the worst Supreme Court decision in our history. Still to this day, it ranks as just the most foul decision ever. So here's the issue. It's March of 1857. The case is actually quite interesting and important. The facts of the case, remember Marbury versus Madison, it's a silly case in terms of like what people were suing over and is rather boring and dull. This one's rather exciting and interesting. There was a slave by the name of Dred Scott. He was born in Missouri, and his master, Dr. Emerson, was an army surgeon. He had served his whole life in the army and had taken Dred Scott to various places in Missouri. But then he was stationed outside of Missouri in what was called Wisconsin Territory at the time. He served all through the 1840s at Fort Snelling, which was in federal territory, not a state. So who decides slavery in the territories? The federal government does, and the federal government had banned slavery there in 1787 under the Articles of Confederation, that weak government, when Jefferson passed the Northwest Ordinance. If you guys remember that, that was way back when. Before we even had the Constitution, when we had this previous one, the Articles of Confederation. Now, all those laws, just transferred over to the new republic. It said so in the new Constitution. And Dred Scott lived in Wisconsin for many, many years. He met a woman, a free Black woman who was living there in Wisconsin. And he was what was known as a house servant or a house slave. He, didn't pick or cultivate cotton out in the field, but he was sort of what you might call a valet, right? He's irons his master's clothes, preps his meals, basically his house servant. And he was told by several of these abolitionists living in Wisconsin that slavery doesn't exist here. Your master is a dum-dum. He brought you here and he can't take you home. So Dred Scott got married to this free Black woman. He's, got help and legal help from abolitionists who lived there. He sues his master. When his master says, all right, it's time to go back to Missouri, he says, no, not going to. And it kind of goes back and forth in the courts. Dred Scott will win, and then it's appealed, and then his master will win. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. To me, this is a very easy case, cut and dry, right? You took a slave to an area where slavery was abolished. And if slavery doesn't exist there, then you have no control over your slave there, and you can't bring him back. You freed him. He didn't steal himself. He didn't run away. You brought him there. You are a dummy. Well, the Supreme Court, amazingly, 7-2, argued that Dred Scott, A, could not even use the courts because he wasn't a human being. He wasn't a citizen under federal law, so we can't even hear this case. And second, Chief Justice Taney from Baltimore, who was a slave owner, ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and Congress does not have the authority to ban slavery in the territories, which is just unbelievable, because if Congress doesn't have the ability to ban slavery in the territories, it doesn't have the power to ban slavery in DC or anywhere. This is a very radical decision to make in 1857. Again, in 1787, even Jefferson said, not only can we ban slavery, we are banning it in the Northwest Territories. It shouldn't spread there. Southerners had so radicalized by this time that they said, not only can slavery spread to the territories, but it must. You cannot ban it. Now, what's their argument? This is insane what their argument is. Why does the Constitution allow slave owners the right to take slaves to the territories? Why does Congress not have this authority? Because if you actually look at the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, it says that Congress has the authority to make all laws with respect to the territories. They can do whatever they want. Yeah, but the Fifth Amendment does say that the federal government can't take your property. And when it bans slavery in the territories, it's taking your property. Now, just pause for a moment. Does this make any sense to you that you live in a slave state, Congress bans slavery in another area of the country that you don't live in, they're not taking your slave, you choose to move there, bringing up the issue and taking your slave to an area where it's banned. Didn't you free your slave and give up your property? The government didn't take it. This would be like if I were to get on an airplane with 100 kilos of cocaine in LAX and fly to Puerto Rico, a US territory, And when I get there, customs would confiscate it and say, this is illegal, we're taking it all. And I would sue in court and say, you're taking my property, right? Let's imagine it was legal to do that in California. I guess it's not, but let's just say it was, or maybe, marijuana would be a better example because that's legal in California and against the federal law to take it there. Is that a cogent, smart argument to make that someone is stealing my property and I have the right to take whatever property I want? Congress decides this issue, not the individual. It was an insane decision to make. Again, most Northerners laughed at it. They would have if it wasn't so serious. And they just said, this is an insane decision, and they have no law to back it up. Well, Supreme Court, we often revere them and say, oh, they're arbiters of justice. No, they're human beings just like you or I. And when they want to, they just say whatever they want and don't justify it with anything from the Constitution. And that's what they did. It was unbelievable. Southerners felt, well, Northerners are more calm, deliberate. They revere the Constitution and the law. They're not going to fight us too much on this. Au contraire, you will see that they will not rest on this. They basically are being told in 1857, Republicans are, your entire party is based on the abolition of slavery in the territories. You might as well pack up your tent and go home because you can't even do that. And Republicans said, oh no, we will. We're going to get elected to the presidency enough times. We will pack the court with judges that agree with us. They'll overturn that decision and we will ban slavery in the territories. It just sort of hardened their resolve to keep this issue alive. And then another issue came up, hooray. The Lecompton Constitution, right? You guys know Lecompton? It's the French Compton, right? Right next to Les Watts and Les South Central. You guys saw that great movie, Straight Outta Lecompton, a couple of years ago? It was great. Lecompton is sort of the counterpart of Lawrence. Lawrence, Kansas is where all of the radical abolitionists moved to Kansas Territory. Lecompton is where all the pro-slavery people moved. And under the law, under Kansas, Nebraska, once your state was big enough, once your territory was big enough, you could apply for statehood and you would have this referendum. You would basically say, here's our Constitution. We want to come into the Union. Now, at this time, it's known as Bleeding Kansas. Literally, people are murdering each other in the streets. It's completely lawless. It's out of control. Civil War is already broken out in Kansas territories. It was a precursor of what would happen eventually. And the town of Lecompton proposes this pro-slavery constitution. Now, everyone in Lawrence voted against it, but essentially what happened was a lot of ballot box stuffing. You had certain areas of Kansas, like in Lecompton, where 175% of the population voted in favor of the pro-slavery constitution there. And so Congress took a look at this. You have to then take that and then, your vote and your constitution of your state and say, here, Congress, are we admitted to the Union? Well, Northerners blocked the admission of Kansas. They just said, this is a fraudulent vote. This is not popular sovereignty. This is people rigging elections. We can't allow this. Amazingly, Stephen Douglas, who was in favor of Kansas, Nebraska, he stood in the way of this because he basically felt, look, I don't care whether it comes in as slave or free, but the vote has to be legitimate. This is a test for popular sovereignty. This is what's going to save the Union, is we're going to go territory to territory, having these elections and having these constitutions, either being slave or free. It has to be orderly. It has to be honest. It has to be legal. And this is not a good first case. Go back and do it again. When Douglas did that, he destroyed his career because he was in a pro-slavery party that did not care about justice or what was right. They just knew that they were losing on states, right? Wisconsin by this time had come in, California had, Iowa had, Minnesota had. And so now the northern states had about a 4 or 5 state edge over the southern states in the Senate and in the House. And they just said, we got to catch up, either by cheating or, by honest means, but it doesn't matter. We need Kansas. And when Douglas did this, he destroyed his chances of ever becoming president. And then you have the very infamous John Brown raid on Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry, Virginia, today West Virginia, was an armory in the South. And it's where the Federal Army kept a lot of its weapons. And it was in a very mountainous region in this town called Harper's Ferry. Now, John Brown, this radical abolitionist that had been killing people in Kansas, had really gotten tired of like waiting around and voting on this issue. He was a hardcore Northern Baptist, who believed that Old Testament style sin could only be purged with blood, right? If you read the New Testament, what you need to do is ask for forgiveness, and God and Jesus will forgive you. Old Testament says that the only way that sin can be purged is by the shedding of blood. Very old school kind of, Protestant belief. And so John Brown believed that the only way to really satisfy God was to go on a murderous rampage and kill every slave owner in the South. That you needed to start this big slave revolt that would then snowball and rolled all through the South, engulfing it in an enormous rebellion, like a Haiti-style rebellion. And he would egg that along by attacking the armory at Harper's Ferry, by going down the mountain to various communities there, by arming slaves, encouraging them to rebel, and then taking those weapons from their master and passing it on to the next plantation. Now, the plan sounds terrifying to Southerners, and it sounds encouraging to Yankee abolitionists. It was not well thought out. It was a joke. It was ridiculous. And it showed that John Brown, although brave and the real deal and putting his life on the line, was no military genius or strategist. He didn't understand what he was doing there. He didn't reconnoiter this mission, meaning he didn't come to the town a few days in advance and look around to see, where the entrance and exit routes were in and out of the valley. When he takes over Harper's Ferry, he stops the train that's coming through town. And the conductor says, "What's going on?" And they basically tell him, there's a huge slave revolt and we're behind it. And then inexplicably, they just let the train go, and it goes on to the next town, and it goes to the telegraph office and says, "Warn Washington, there's a huge slave revolt in Harper's Ferry." 16 hours later, the federal troops arrive, led by Robert E. Lee. They then apprehend John Brown, put him on trial, and within a month, he's hanged for treason. And like the beating of Sumner by Brooks, it wasn't so much the John Brown raid, it was how it was received that really shocked people. Northerners celebrated this guy. Not all of them. Most Northerners just said, "God, this guy is a lunatic. He's just crazy." Many Northerners embraced him. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that he would make the gallows like Christ made the cross, right? That John Brown was this sort of like Christ-like figure that was atoning for the sins of slavery, and he was this wonderful person. Most people thought he was a terrorist. That word didn't even really exist at the time. They called him a criminal and murderer and all this other stuff, but that's what he would have been considered at the time, a terrorist. And Northerners wrote songs about him. They wrote songs called John Brown's Body, and it was about how he was hanged, but his body would rise from the grave, march through the South, and liberate all of the slaves. Very much sort of fusing together John Brown with Christ, which Southerners just shook their heads and said, Northerners have lost their minds. They're not our brothers and sisters anymore. They are hostile foreigners, and we can't abide this. Southerners then lost their minds and went into a hysterical frenzy. After, this is October of 1859, John Brown's hanged the next month in November. Going into 1860, they were absolutely paranoid. This is sort of like the summer of 1789, if you guys have read about the French Revolution and about how most French peasants were certain that Louis was going to send these teams of what they call brigands, sort of like, criminal elements, soldiers basically, that were mercenaries, into every village in France and just kill everyone in favor of the revolution. Now, no such plot existed, but rumors caused paranoia and caused people to do crazy things like it did here. Every Southerner was certain that there was a John Brown lurking in their hometown. Every Yankee was suspect, and pretty much every Southern town had at least one or two Northerners living in it. This is one country. Families had intermarried. And so it was like, oh yeah, the Johnsons down the street. The father is born in Massachusetts or Connecticut, and he married this woman here from South Carolina, and he lives here. Now they were suspect. They didn't trust him. Most doctors, dentists, bankers, who lived in every corner of the South were educated in the North, because Southerners didn't really respect those professions. And so pretty much every dentist in every community was a Northern Yankee educated at Massachusetts or Connecticut or New York, and had moved down to the South and was making good money there because there was no competition. And now they were tarred and feathered. They were lynched. They were harassed. They were threatened to get out of the South. And Southerners started building up these sort of slave patrols. It was sort of the beginning of the Confederate Army. Even if you didn't own slaves, they drafted you and they said, you have to patrol all of the roads of the South. Slaves, this may seem weird to you guys, but slaves were often given day passes. Like the master would say, hey, go down to market and fetch me, my groceries for the week. And you'd have a little pass. And if you were Black in the South, they wanted to keep track of who was free and who was a slave, because there were many free Blacks. And so if you were free Black, you had to have an ID saying that you were free. And if you were a slave, you had to have, your master's little token with you that showed that you were his property. And so now there's slave patrols everywhere in the South, just on point, paranoid, terrified. They're going to be a huge revolt. It was exactly the wrong climate to have a presidential election, but our elections fall by the time cycle. So we had to do it. Now, going into this election, in the summer, the Republicans nominate, pretty much unheard of, Abraham Lincoln. There were several other bigwigs in the party, like William Seward of New York. Other people thought perhaps Salmon Chase of Ohio. These were much better known people, but they were considered too radical. Lincoln was kind of unheard of. He was born in Kentucky, so he was a Southerner by birth. He had only served 2 years in the House of Representatives, so most people thought there was no way he would do it. But he was very smart, had this issue locked down about slavery in the territories, and so he would be the nominee. The Democrats could not unify around a single candidate. Basically what happened is they held their convention in the worst possible place they could hold it, in South Carolina, in Charleston. And the pro-slavery element of there basically broke the party in two, meaning most of the delegates wanted to nominate Stephen Douglas of Illinois, thinking he was a moderate. He was a Northerner who didn't own slaves, but had pro-slavery attitudes. Let's get behind him. That way, most of these, states in the middle, like Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland, will probably vote for him. But they weren't so radical to vote for a hardcore pro-slavery person out of South Carolina. Southerners refused to go along with that. Stephen Douglas was just as much of an abolitionist as Abraham Lincoln. And again, Lincoln was no abolitionist. He was just a free soiler, because Douglas had gone along with blocking Kansas's admission to the Union. And so Southerners break from the party. They nominate their own person, Breckinridge, and Northerners kind of hold their own convention in Illinois and nominate Douglas, and they go into the election divided, right? Just look at this election that we just had. Imagine that the Democrats broke in half. Bernie Sanders ran as a progressive, Biden ran as a moderate. Who wins? Well, Trump would win, because if you go into an election divided, your opponent's going to win no matter what you do. At least in the American political system, that's how it works. And so the Democrats basically destroyed themselves. They go into this party divided. Lincoln wins, and he wins with a mere 39% of the vote. He wins every northern state, I'm sorry, not Fremont, but Breckinridge, John C. Breckinridge, wins every southern state. Amazingly, Douglas only wins one state, even though Douglas is really the only national figure who basically said, here's the three issues, right? One issue is slavery in the territories, but here's the three positions on it. The big issue in 1860 was, what about slavery in the territories? We've been arguing about it for 12 years, since 1848. And so much had gone on that here was our position. After Kansas, Nebraska, you got the Republican Party, the solid North, that says, look, we're no abolitionists. We can't strike at slavery where it exists, but we want to keep it out of the territories so that eventually in 20 or 30 years, there'll be enough free states to pass a constitutional amendment that'll end slavery peacefully. Southerners nominated Breckinridge that said, hey, we already have a Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott, that said you can't ban slavery in the territories, so we want slavery to necessarily exist there. It must exist and spread. The only person in the middle with popular sovereignty is Douglas, and he got wiped out. He won one state. He won the state of Missouri, and he lost every other state, which is kind of depressing for Douglas. But also what it showed you is what's called polarization. Now, polarization is like, if you guys imagine like a bell curve, right? That would be representational of most opinions. If you ask people, how you feel about any issue, right? How do you feel about taxes? Should they be higher? Should they be lower? About the same. You get a nice little bell curve where the vast majority, about 75% of the people, are under the widest part of the bell curve that are in the middle. And you get these fringe elements on the outside that think taxes should be raised up to 95% or taxes should be non-existent. Those are kind of radical positions, and you have a nice bell curve. What happens with polarization is the bell curve gets stretched out and you get two bell curves. That's polarization, of pulling towards the poles rather than towards the middle. Unfortunately, this is what's happened in America recently in the last 20 years, is that both parties, Democrat and Republican, have been stretched out to the most extreme, fringes of elements of their party. This is what happened in America in the 1850s as well. There was no one really in the middle anymore who said slavery, yeah, I don't care that much. You were either passionately wanting to take it out of the territories or passionately wanting to extend it there. There was no middle ground. And because the North had the population, it won this election. An anti-slavery party won, the first time ever in American history. Remember, before this time, every party that had won the White House, Democrat or Whig, had just sort of said, slavery, it's not a national issue, it's a state issue. We have no opinion on it. Now, it turned out the Democratic Party really was, more pro-slavery, and Whig was more anti-slavery. But they had never had an explicit position like this. Now Lincoln won, and he was saying, I'm going after slavery in the territories. And especially after John Brown's raid, Southerners felt there are schemes and plots everywhere. There are Northerners plotting huge violent rebellions everywhere. We need a Southerner in the White House to send in the troops into our states. Do you think that Lincoln, a Yankee from the North, is going to protect our property and our way of life? Never. Actually, he would have, and he pledged at his first inauguration that he was no abolitionist, that he would put down slave revolts, that he would defend the Fugitive Slave Act because it was the law. As much as he disagreed with it, he said, my attorney general is going to catch runaway slaves because that is the law. I'd like to change the law, but I'm not a king. I have to act through the Congress and the courts. Southerners were so hysterical and paranoid at this point, they just weren't listening to Lincoln. He gave a beautiful address where he said, we're not enemies, but friends. Now, again, in the American political system, it's very strange. Elections are in November, and nowadays, Inauguration Day is January 20th. Back in this time, it was March 4th. So there is a long period of time here, about 4.5 months, where the lame duck is president. James Buchanan was still president from the election day in November until March 4th. Now, what happened was Lincoln's election created a huge crisis. When Lincoln got elected, South Carolina basically felt, well, that's the end of it. We are out of the Union. We can't stay. That this is the beginning of the end. Slavery is going to be severely weakened and maybe abolished in the next 10 years. Because now the North is going to see they win every presidential election. They'll change the courts, and through various executive orders, they just won't defend us when there's a big slave revolt. So South Carolina, learning its lessons from 1850, just voted to secede on their own unilaterally. What had happened in 1850 is South Carolina held a lot of meetings with its sister neighboring states. They met with North Carolina, they met with Georgia, they met with Tennessee, and they basically said, look, if we don't get a compromise out of this 1850 issue out of California, we're probably going to secede. Are you with us? And the other states sort of talk South Carolina out of it. South Carolina learned if you just secede, everyone else will have to react to a situation that already exists. And so they did. Lincoln's elected in November. The next month in December, on December 20th, in fact, South Carolina held a secession convention. They basically, the whole state elected delegates, and the governor opened up a convention where it passed 160-0 that South Carolina was going to secede. Now, if you don't know what secede means, it means to withdraw yourself from the Union. Now, it's been debated ever since, did they have the right to do this? And I would say very plainly, no. They did not have the right to do this for a couple of reasons. Now, first, it is true the Constitution is silent on whether you can secede. It doesn't say you can secede or you can't. It doesn't say. We know under the Articles of Confederation, it did say that you cannot secede. It said it very explicitly. And we know that the U.S. Constitution was a stronger union in every way. And so it's just sort of common sense that you wouldn't be able to leave this union either. If it is a stronger union and it is a stronger federal government and it's weaker states in every possible way under this new Constitution, and you couldn't secede under the previous government, well, of course you can't secede. Second, it says in Article 1, Section 9, it has all the limitations of what states cannot do. States can't grant letters of marque and reprisal. You don't need to know what that is. They can't coin money of their own. And they cannot, it says, quote, no state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation with any other state. To me, that's very plain. They literally left the Union and formed a confederation. Now, Southerners would say, yeah, but what that means is you can't form a confederation and remain in the Union. But if you leave, then you can. I would say, points for creativity, but no, that just doesn't make sense. Third, and Lincoln said this, he just said, no government on earth ever formed and allowed constituent states to leave whenever they wanted to. If you could, then any state could leave at any time for any reason, and that's not a union, right? Is basically, if we allow South Carolina to leave, and when they left, it triggered a crisis where 6 other states left too, then northern states we would just splinter into not only, various states, but then counties would secede from states, and we would just fracture until it was just individual human beings in their own country. This didn't make sense. Like, no government on earth would allow this. And so Lincoln's position was, you can't do this. Now, Buchanan's position, who was still the president, was secession is illegal, but it's illegal for the federal government to use force to bring states back into the Union. So it's illegal, but we can't punish you. Buchanan has gone down in history as possibly the worst president ever, one of the worst anyway, because he literally did nothing. Because South Carolina left, and then Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas, all rapidly between December of 1860 and February of 1861, they rapidly seceded and essentially formed their own government. They wrote a constitution. They formed an army. They held elections. They acted pretty rapidly there. Now, it was only 7 states to begin with. Lincoln was really hoping that this was sort of a temper tantrum, like when a kid's just rolling around on the floor in the cereal aisle, Mom, buy me the Spider-Man, Fruit Loops, and you refuse, and they're just having a tantrum. One of the best things you can do is just walk away. And the kid eventually goes, oh yeah, why am I throwing this fit? He thought that tempers would flare, and after a month or two, Southerners would kind of come to their senses and go, geez, what are we doing? This is insane. We can't do this. He very much underestimated their resolve. They were very happy. There were huge celebrations in the South that they were free of the North and they could do anything they wanted now. Now, Lincoln comes to power, like I said, on March 4th, gives a wonderful speech. And the second that he sits down at his office, there are multiple crises going on throughout the South. In each one of these 7 states that seceded, the state government and the Confederate Army, which existed co-equally in all of these 7 states, started seizing federal property. They took over military bases, they took over post offices, they took over the federal courts, just marched in and said, we don't recognize the authority of the federal government anymore, get out. And there was, by the time Lincoln becomes president, there was only a couple of exceptions to this rule. There was just 1 or 2 military bases. The most prominent of all would be Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, a floating island, essentially a mile off the coast of Charleston, guarding that harbor. But now it was a foreign entity, and Southerners were calling on Fort Sumter to surrender. Major Anderson, who was the commandant there, was sending via telegraph messages back to Washington telling Lincoln, we only have food to hold out for another week or so. You got to do something, because I'm not surrendering. And Lincoln told him, hold strong, hold fast, don't surrender. We need to, keep the flag there. But the rebels had cut off all food supplies going to Fort Sumter, and so they were going to run out of food. So Lincoln developed a plan where he basically said, okay, what I'm going to do is I have to do what's right and, keep the last federal installation there in the South, but I don't want to appear provocative. If I send a warship down there and it's fired upon, I'll look bad because it's a warship. But I don't want to send an unarmed ship that will get sunk and put lives at risk, and the food won't get there. So he armed a warship, filled it with supplies, and then told the South that it was coming on such and such day. I forget exactly. I think it was coming on April 14th or 15th of 1861. That way, if they fire on it, it's their fault. He said, this is a peaceful mission, but the ship will defend itself. The ship was struck by a cannonball, but it didn't fire back, and it returned to the North. And so Lincoln basically said, okay, we're going to have to send another ship. And he told them. And so now if you're the South, you basically have to either take the fortress or just allow this crisis to continue indefinitely. And the South finally lost their patience and said, we have to fire on Fort Sumter and force them to surrender. And so at 4:30 in the morning on April 12th, 1861, Southern batteries, that's, cannon from South Carolina, from the Confederate Army, opened fire on Fort Sumter. They returned fire and shot back for 36 hours. This artillery duel continued. Amazingly, this is the opening to the bloodiest war in American history. No one is harmed, no one is killed. There was one exception. There was a Confederate horse that was hit by a cannonball and killed. I know that all of you are just jaw dropped now. Every time I tell this story, people are more upset at the horse that was killed than the 620,000 human beings. But for some reason, that's how we're wired. It really upsets people to learn that in 1692, 19 people were accused of witchcraft and hanged, and a dog, and everybody gasps when they hear that the dog was killed, and they don't really care about the 19 human beings. In any case, Buttercup here, that's my name for the horse, probably wasn't his name, but I'm just naming him that, got killed. Everybody else survived, but basically this is the opening salvo of the war. Because look at what both sides do. Lincoln doesn't go to the Congress. He doesn't say, I need a declaration of war, because he feels this is not another country that is attacking us. This is a rebellion from within, and presidents don't need authorization to put down rebellions. I'm just going to use my powers as commander-in-chief to protect the Union. He had an old militia act from the 1790s that allowed him, without any authorization, just to call up 75,000 soldiers to put down rebellions like this for 90 days. That's what he had authority. So he started calling for volunteers. This would be humorous if it weren't so sad that Lincoln so underestimated the South and thought all it's going to take is 75,000 troops for 90 days. It would take 4 years, and the army would be almost 10 times that size by 1865, and a whole lot of people killed. Lincoln honestly felt that Southerners would just snap out of it, that when they saw federal troops marching through their towns, they would throw down their weapons and say, my God, what have we done? We're sorry. We were just fooling was all. We just little hot-headed and just things got away from us. Well, that's not how they react at all. Lincoln doesn't even use the volunteers at first. He just calls them up. And 3 days after Fort Sumter, on April 15th, 4 other Southern states secede. Okay, remember, it was just 7 Southern states that started it. South Carolina started, then it was Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. Okay, it was those 7 Southern states, deep South. Notice also this obliterates this myth. It had nothing to do with slavery. Well, why did the state that acted first had the highest proportion of slaves? All the others that would follow immediately, slaves represented 40 to 60% of their populations. The other states that had, there were other states that had slavery, right? Numerous others. They did not act immediately. These other 4 upper South states, Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee, they felt, we don't like Lincoln, but this is not an adequate reason to secede. You can't secede just because you lost an election. But when Lincoln called up the troops, they then said, okay, there will be a civil war. Lincoln is going to march this army through Virginia, through North Carolina, on the way to South Carolina. Are we going to allow a federal army to violate our territory and to punish brutally our sister state in South Carolina? And these states said no, and they seceded as well. There's a huge difference between North Carolina and South Carolina, even today. After all, North Carolina voted for Obama twice, and they nearly voted for Biden in this election. It was very narrowly that they lost. South Carolina, it wasn't even close. Likewise, in the 1860s, South Carolina is the first state to secede. North Carolina is the last. And North Carolina almost voluntarily rejoined the Union in 1864. They had a gubernatorial election, that's an election of governor, and the guy who lost in 1864 openly campaigned and said, this war is a catastrophe, and we are going to be conquered and brought back into the Union by force. It was just a few months away that they were going to lose. And this gentleman was running on a platform where he said, elect me and I will voluntarily negotiate with Lincoln and we'll re-enter the Union and get to keep our slaves, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that person lost, but the fact that you could say that showed that North Carolina was very different. North Carolina today has 2 world-class universities, Duke and UNC. Sorry, no offense to South Carolina, they don't have very great universities there. So, big difference between the 2. North Carolina did not want to secede, but their position was, well, there will be a civil war. What side are we on? We're with the South. They felt probably slavery would be destroyed by this war, and they were right about that. And they said, our only chance to keep it is we don't like that we got dragged into this conflict, but since it exists, we have to fight with the side that we associate with. Now, if you're Lincoln, you have to now sort of decide, what are you going to do? You could use force and, invade the South. And again, this was the fear that not only Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina would secede, but there were 4 other states as well that had slavery: Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware. Okay, now Delaware's a tiny state. It almost is insignificant in this argument, but the other 3 were big states. Kentucky is right along the Ohio River with major ports there. Baltimore is a huge population center with a huge harbor, banking, manufacturing. If they left too, this war would get out of control and we might never win. And so Lincoln wanted to act very slowly and delicately. And so he said, I don't want to just immediately mobilize the army and march it in. He just announced it first. These other 4 states left. Then he held sort of negotiations with the 4 quote unquote border states. And this really showed his genius. Now, he could have used diplomacy, but there was no way to do that, basically, is that these 7 states that were out of the Union, now 11 states, there was no way that they were going to negotiate. He did the only thing he could do, which was call up the army, call up the 75,000 volunteers. And after the other 4 states seceded and became 11 states, you just had to send in the army and get it done. That was the only way. And on the other hand, reassure the border states, which is what he did. This really shows Lincoln's genius. In the opening couple months of the war, the biggest issue is, what's the loyalty of every state in the Union? All the free states were going to remain for sure. But what about the border states? Border states, you guys would probably use the term hybrid states. They're states where slavery exists, but fewer than 20% of the population is enslaved. It's not integral to the economy of that state, right? Kentucky has big cities up on the Ohio River, factories, banks, shipping. Same thing with St. Louis, Missouri, same thing with Baltimore. But slavery does exist in certain corners of these states, but it's not huge like it is in South Carolina. What would they do? How would they respond? So Lincoln was very certain that Maryland had to stay in the Union, because if Maryland secedes, Virginia already had, DC would be surrounded on all sides by enemy territory. So Lincoln used force in Maryland. He just said, I can't sort of negotiate with them and tiptoe around. Lincoln sent the army in and did things that were questionable at the time. I forgive him, but some people like to rediscover that Lincoln was a tyrant, because he just arrested people, just hundreds of people that were journalists who were sort of like, yeah, secession, we should secede in Maryland too. Politicians that were pro-secession, journalists, individuals, anyone caught within any distance of railroads or telegraph lines who wasn't supposed to be there, who might be a saboteur, just throw them in military stockade with no trial, just for months on end. Now, this isn't like the Soviet Union where people were put in forced labor camps for years on end. Most of these people were arrested and then let out after 6 weeks or 2 months or 5 months. But he did do this. He suspended habeas corpus and just locked people up and said, I'm not even telling you the charges, because if Baltimore had held a secession convention and they voted to leave the Union, that's the ball game. The White House would be completely surrounded and he would just be arrested. Wouldn't even take an army. It would just take like one guy to march up to the White House and arrest him, and then the Civil War is over and the South is won. So Maryland, he uses force. Kentucky, he used patience. Lincoln was born in Kentucky and he understood that they don't want to be bossed around. He didn't just march the army into Kentucky. He waited. He held negotiations. He said, if you want our help, please request it. In Kentucky, at the outset of the war, when secession happened, they said, we're neutral. We're not going to send troops to put down the rebellion, but we're not going to join it ourselves. We're neutral. You can't really stay neutral in a civil war. The South would invade Kentucky and claim that they were liberating it. They were coming to the defense of Kentucky against the Yankees. Lincoln waited, and finally the governor of Kentucky invited the army in, and Lincoln occupies Kentucky and it stays in the Union. Missouri is a bizarre story, fascinating story. I've read books just about the Civil War in Missouri because things get way out of control. It gets bizarre. Basically, the government in Missouri held a secession convention and it was voted down. And so Lincoln breathed a sigh of relief and said, well, they're not going to secede. The governor of Missouri tried to take his state out anyway by basically wiring Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, and saying, hey, in St. Louis, we're right on the Mississippi. Send some weapons from New Orleans up the Mississippi. We'll put them in crates and, put fake labels on it so people won't know that it's weapons. because we have federal troops stationed in St. Louis. We're going to arm these pro-slavery militias in St. Louis, arrest the federal troops, and then just by force take our state out, secede, like in a coup without even a vote. At least in South Carolina, they held a vote on it. In Missouri, the governor tried to do it with help from a foreign government, from the Confederate Army. Well, this plan leaked to the federal army. The federal army then marched on all the ringleaders and the governor and all the people behind the plot. These people left the state. Most of the legislature just vanished, fled to Arkansas. And so the secession convention that had voted secession down now just became its sort of de facto government and appointed a new governor. And fighting just breaks out in Missouri on both sides. And you basically have a civil war within a civil war. But nonetheless, technically, Missouri is going to remain in the Union. It would never, send armies to the South. And, the fighting there is kind of contained within Missouri itself. But Missouri does stay within the Union. So does Delaware. West Virginia is created out of Virginia. West Virginia was always just part of Virginia. This also explodes this weird myth that this had nothing to do with slavery. Notice that the 7 hardcore Southern states leave first. The reluctant states of the Upper South leave next. The border states never leave. And even part of Virginia decides to secede from the Confederacy. When Virginia voted to secede, the vote wasn't equal throughout the states. The coastal region in the east, that was where all the tobacco plantations were, they voted to secede, but the hill country up in the northwestern part of the state voted totally against it because they didn't own slaves. You can't really grow cotton up in the highlands there, up in the Appalachian Mountains. And so those folks who were very racist and didn't want slavery to end still felt, we're going to get invaded. The Yankees will come over the river from Ohio, invade us, destroy our farms, and we don't have any slaves to begin with. This is ridiculous. So they voted to actually secede from Virginia. The army did come over the river from Ohio and protected them, and they just sort of created the state out of nothing, which is really weird. The Constitution actually says no state can be created out of another state without that state's permission. Kind of like we did in Maine, right? Is that Maine was part of Massachusetts, and we asked permission in 1820, can we cut this part off and become a state, and Massachusetts agreed. Here, Virginia did not agree, but they had left the Union, so the federal government just said, we're going to cut you in half and make this new state. And so West Virginia now exists. Yay, West Virginia. Now, the reason I mention this is to show you the genius of Lincoln. Some legends are true, and Lincoln is our best president. In every poll, he always wins. Preserve the Union. And there's moments like this where he was truly a genius in his political strategy, forcing the South to fire on Fort Sumter first. So forever, even today, we look back and say, well, it was the South's fault. They fired the first shot. Lincoln did everything he could to avoid this, right? He has a war on his hands because he got elected. And the South was such spoil sports that they used all this violence, and it's their fault. And he kept the border states. These are states that had slavery, and he got them to agree to stay in the Union. Pretty genius. Maryland, he kind of used force, but you get the point. Now, we haven't actually even got to the war yet. We'll get to that. Remember that battles, we don't go over it that much. What we do go over much more is the consequences. We'll look at that. We'll look at how immediately there starts to be these consequences that occur because of this conflict. But we're right in April 1861. We'll wrap up the war and its consequences next time, okay? All right. Hopefully you guys are having a great Thanksgiving. I will talk to you later.